just so excited to be here. I wrote my book, Luggage, which was published in 2018. And it's so nice to have the opportunity to now talk with two new Object Lessons authors about their wonderful new books, both of which I've enjoyed so hugely. So I think we've got a lot. We're going to have a really nice time this evening. I thought we might start by having both of you introduce your books to us and talk a little bit about the genesis of your projects. Thanks.
Okay, so the first thing I was going to say is that I think Maria and I may have both discovered the series from the same other Object Lessons book, which is one called High Heel.
Yes.
If I'm not mistaken, you said. And so, I had heard about the series and read some of the tie-in essays that in the past few years had been in the Atlantic. And I just love the idea as, I was a history major as an undergrad. And even though I'm predominantly writing narrative nonfiction now, I love the idea of looking at an object as a way to understand something broader about our society. So that sort of background simmering interest in the series. And then in 2014, I had my first child, and I started to notice that there was not a lot of the kind of writing I wanted to read about parenthood. I felt like there were lots of very useful, but medical guides about here's what to do if your baby has a fever, but not the kind of writing that felt like a community. And then on the other side were these sort of flippant, silly books like Mommy Needs Some Wine or something like that didn't really feel like me either, But I knew all of these women that I was friends with or that I had met through writing groups who wanted to have serious conversations about motherhood and society's attitude toward children and their parents. So those two ideas kind of came together when I thought about a stroller, which is just such a visible object that's, immediately identifies someone as a caregiver, then it has class connotations, and sort of it followed from there. So that was those two sides of the history and object and research side, plus the personal interest in seeing more writing about parenthood that was a little bit more serious culturally, came together in my proposal.
So I have a really similar story. We share that love. Amanda and I share that love of wanting to take an object and then peel off all the layers. We're just going down that rabbit hole, to mix metaphors, where we want to. I think you oftentimes as a writer, when you're writing about an object, you start with a premise that's pretty much a common understanding. We all agree on it. Oh yeah, strollers are this or dolls are this. And then you seek to surprise and kind of uncover more and more things so that there's this aha moment when the reader is going through and being like, wait, what? What am I even reading about anymore? This is this object? So I had written for the series. It does have an essay counterpart, which is on the Atlantic. And I had written two different essays before I ever wrote this book. I had written about, funnily enough, I wrote about hair dryers and I wrote about bidets. And I swear, when they write my obituary, they'll write Maria Teresa Hart. She wrote about bidets, and I'm totally cool with that because that article that I wrote, I had a blast writing it. It was so much fun. And something that was really unexplored was that there is this feminine history to bidets. So both of those objects, they had the roots as being this formative feminine object, and something that had that unexplored history to it. But for both those essays, I wrote them and I felt like, well, that's that. I said what I needed to say. There wasn't a book there. And I had read High Heel as well, Summer Brennan's book, and I was completely captivated by it. And it was the first time where I really thought, I want to write a book. Oh my gosh, this is what I want to do. I hadn't been tempted to do that before. And I was casting around a little bit for another object like that felt really meaty, felt book length. And I definitely hit on doll as being something that, this could have been the first in a series of 100 books on dolls, of course. The subject is just there was a lot left on the cutting room floor because there's only so much space that you can devote to exploring the topic, but it is so rich. And when my soundbite to describe it is I say that it's nonfiction, pop culture, feminist criticism of dolls, doll history, doll culture, from Raggedy Ann to Barbie to android sex dolls, because it really does have this incredible range And it is that object that, for myself, I mean, one of the incredible things that I think about when I think about dolls is that I don't have a conscious memory where I didn't have dolls in my life. The earliest memories I have from my childhood, there were dolls there. And I have to say that that's a very common thing for a lot of people that grew up with dolls, that is something where we don't have an existence devoid of dolls. And that's maybe half the population has that experience or somewhere thereabouts. And that's incredible that's something that is so accepted as a part of our society and of our world, and that we don't have an understanding of selfhood without having that model that was there in place since the very beginning. So I find that utterly fascinating. And then on top of that, I am a complete weirdo doll nut, and I have been since I was a little kid. I was obsessed with dolls, not just as playthings, but as objets, this like completely seductive and beautiful and just desirable thing that was behind a glass case, whether that was a window in a toy shop or the Smithsonian, frankly, because when I was a child, I had more or less a normal relationship with toys up until the point that I moved to the DC area, and the Smithsonian became a little bit of my playground. I would get taken there by my parents, and we would look at old trilobites and, like at triceratops and whatever. And we would also, and that's where I discovered, oh, dolls are here too. And dolls are valuable and part of history, and something that is considered, has this significance that it belongs in a museum. And that's when I thought, that's what I want. I want that, which, no allowance on earth is going to get me a Smithsonian level antique. So I began plotting and researching and hunting for fixer-uppers in the classifieds. And that led to this whole mania around dolls, which, as you can tell, continues to this day.
Oh my gosh, I love that. Yeah, I think it's interesting to hear you talk about, again, the kind of ordinary and the extraordinary with objects. I think that both a doll and a stroller are these things that are so much a part of people's daily lives. And the Object Lessons series is about the hidden lives of ordinary things. And I think it's so rich to explore those ordinary things in all their different manifestations, as you're both saying. You mentioned the question of length of the book in terms of thinking about, okay, what's my idea? What's an idea that I can turn into a book? Object Lessons books are, they are shorter books and they are smaller books, as kind of, rich and fascinating and dense, but shorter than a lot of standard books. So I was wondering if you would both like to talk about that sort of balance between expansiveness and focus, the question of what you leave out, what does end up on the cutting room floor, as well as what's like really nice about writing a short book. It feels like such a wonderful, unique thing about this series.
Yeah, I can kick us off. I think actually, for the most part, it was wonderful. The restriction, the length, it makes these books feel like a little jewel. You're very hyper-focused about what goes in, what you deeply care about that needs to be in this book. And it also alleviates a little bit of you're not writing the tome, the end-all, be-all book about this. You can't. I mean, I can't write the definitive history of dolls and doll culture in this pocket-sized book. So I have to make it something else, something that is exploratory, something that feels even experimental. And I definitely went for that. I mean, the fact that I had the freedom to be able to include an actual functional paper doll in the pages of my book, and to declare to the reader, this is not just a book, you're holding a doll in your hands, and have that be a portion of the book, and explore the play, the element of play in the book, was definitely something that I don't think would be allowed in the other type of book that I'm describing, which is this all-encompassing, very comprehensive, serious history of dolls. So definitely the length to me was a huge benefit. I did sacrifice quite a bit that didn't make it into my book. And I do think all the time about like, oh, I didn't include this one part. There's a lot of stuff that I absolutely adore that didn't make it into the book. And one of the biggies is that I just had to kind of close the aperture on what I was going to really focus in on in terms of dolls. And I really tried to keep the focus on more or less the last 100 years of dolls, mostly in the Americas. And also, I really kept it focused on girls and girls' experience of doll play, knowing, and I say this in the intro, that boys and non-binary kids play with dolls too, and they have a different experience of that. And I do explore that a tiny bit, but then I say, like, well, my experience, of course, is being a girl playing with these things, and also all of their messaging is intended for girls. So when other children play with these dolls, they're actually using them in an off-label way. And you'll see sometimes with very conservative parents, if their little boy goes to pick up a doll, it's like it's something radioactive. Like the parents will like swat it out of the kid's hands and be like, no, little Billy, that's not for you. Come over here, come away from all this. So we know that toys are very gender divided, and dolls in particular are, all of their messaging, they really are containers for all these messages about femininity, about womanhood, and what little girls should strive for. So that was something that I kind of had to keep my focus on in order to explore all the things I wanted to explore. And I will just say, as a little funny footnote, sometimes horror fans would come up to me like, and they would be like, there better be a whole chapter in this book about, killer dolls and dolls in horror movies. And I just thought, well, I wish I don't have the luxury of writing an entire chapter just on that topic. Maybe that'll be my next book. Who knows? I love it as a topic. I think it's very fun to explore, but no, I didn't have the luxury and the page length of just doing, a justice to Chucky for pages and pages on end. What about you, Amanda?
So yeah, I share a lot of the sentiments that you had, although I think I maybe felt that I left less on the cutting room floor. Partly the one thing that kept coming up is people would read, there's a chapter in the book about strollers, and it's called something like Strollers in Art and Film, but it's, that's obviously a very broad category. And I write about Mary Cassatt's paintings, and I write about the horror movie trope of the runaway pram, like in Battleship Potemkin, or The Witches, or Ghostbusters. And then a little bit about literature too. And so often people would say like, well, what about Rosemary's Baby, or what? And then they would start to list all these other films. And that chapter in particular was sort of an afterthought, actually, because to me, like a literary or film criticism analysis of strollers as a literary symbol is almost an entire book on its own. So even opening that up felt a little bit like, to your point about you decided to narrow the focus deliberately to roughly the past 100 years, and the parameters to just mainly focus on girls playing with dolls. I sort of felt like I do want to acknowledge that the other things I'm writing in this book come out and we see how strollers or prams are depicted in other media, but I'm not writing a media studies book strictly. My book is part memoir too, and it has these weird diagrams in it, and it has, to your point about the opportunity to be a little bit experimental with the form. I really wanted to make sure I gave space to those elements of the book, even if that meant that, I teach at a university where I see tons and tons of books in the library that are sometimes feel like they're twice as long as they need to be, that it's a super dense treatise on, use of skyscrapers in contemporary film. And it sometimes feels like the average reader probably only needs one chapter of this book. And I understand the politics of academia often kind of dictate that. But a lot of ways I felt like I was trying to push back against that impulse to, as you said, have a completely comprehensive book about strollers. And again, in the chapter where I'm writing about culture and outside the US, I remember emailing with one of our editors and saying, I'm feeling a little bit uncomfortable that I have only really lived in the United States and briefly in Europe, and I've traveled very briefly to Southern Africa and to South America, but I have not had a lot of experience living in other places. So I can do some research, but then I worry that I'm getting into this sort of, putting on airs of being an anthropologist when I'm really not trained in that way. And the anthropology of like baby transport could be an entire college course. So there were a few times where I felt like my book came up against what could be an entire extremely dense sociological or anthropological study. And I really tried to, as you said, be overt with the reader about this is a phenomena I've noticed either anecdotally or in these few examples or from these few interviews I've done, or accounts I've read. And I'm putting this in here as a way for us to think about how this either complicates or reinforces our own experience or my own experience, I guess, because, you know, a lot of the book is drawn from memoir. But I did really think I wanted to be careful about making it clear to the reader that I wasn't claiming to be an expert in fields that I'm not. You know, my training is mostly in history and in English. And so I wanted to try to, when I felt myself veering into a direction that could start to seem like a 500-page book about, you know, slings in sub-Saharan Africa to carry babies, like absolutely that's an important thing to study. And I am not the expert to write that. So just kind of backing away when I felt myself getting over my weight or whatever, what the phrase is, you know, like I'm thinking of the metaphor of balancing.
Yeah, completely. No, I think both everything that you're both saying makes a lot of sense to me and reminds me of my experience as well, of thinking about scope and what you can include and what you can't include, and thinking about your expertise and what you're going to focus on. You both also bring up this relationship between memoir and personal writing and research. And that's another really extraordinary thing I think about the series and about both of your books, is how they do balance both kind of a memoir and personal writing with research. And I really love that balance. And I think it's done differently in all the object lessons books. You had both mentioned High Heel before, and I really love High Heel too. And there's so much flexibility in the series in terms of what that balance looks like from one book to the next. So would you like to say a little bit more about what that balance was for you, kind of how you navigated the personal writing and the more kind of research-based writing and kind of cultural criticism?
Sure. Is it okay if I jump in? Right?
Sure. Yeah, do.
Yeah, I feel honestly more comfortable and fluent as a memoir writer than I do as an academic writer. Even though every piece of writing I pitch or submit, you know, aside from this book, even, I feel like it's in this weird in-between area that takes a lot of explaining to convince to explain what genre this even is trying to be. But a lot of the writing I love to read inhabits that kind of space too. Like I was just reading on Twitter, actually, that Leslie Jameson was writing about a class she's teaching. And I think I might have mentioned this when we talked before, but she, the course description had something to do with ways of looking at the self. And the whole idea of the course, it was for nonfiction writers at the MFA program at Columbia, was to push back against the idea that there's something inherently narcissistic in wanting to reflect on our own experiences. And, you know, in her explanation of why she was teaching this class, she said something like, I am interested in myself, and honestly and sincerely great for you if you're not, but I have a hard time believing that. And I'm also interested in people who are interested in themselves, because it's interesting to talk to people who are self-aware and self-reflective, you know, whether I agree, even outside of the context of writing. So I knew that there were probably readers who would be turned off by some of the memoiristic elements of my book, in the same way that other readers would probably be turned off by the slightly more academic heavy, you know, research about the patent history of strollers. But I just kept trying to think, maybe this sounds a little bit self-indulgent, but I kept thinking, I've always wanted to write a book. I don't know if I'll ever write another one. I certainly hope I do, but I want this book because I felt so fortunate that our editors were very supportive of us taking some risks. Unlike, you know, I've had friends who felt like their vision was pretty narrowed in by market predictions and sort of like that element of publishing. So I felt like, how lucky am I that if I want to end this book with a scene of me going to a park where I used to run with my kids and feeling really nostalgic, that I'm sure someone read it and thought, oh, this is so sentimental, but it was very authentic to my experience. So I felt like by that point, the book had sort of become a time capsule too of those years when my kids were spending a lot of time in their stroller. And I just sort of felt like, well, why not? You know, I'm going to take that risk that I alienate someone with too much memoir at the same time that I'm going to alienate someone else with too much research. And, you know, the fact that it even has an index, you know, will turn off some readers. So I felt like, similarly to the way that the short length was sort of freeing. This weird crossover, these academic crossover books as a genre were kind of freeing too, because that often feels like a hard type of writing to explain or to convince someone to publish. And it was really, really nice to have like gone into this project knowing I had the support of the editors that I was working with, and that even, if something bombed, they would help me pull it back and figure out what was going wrong, instead of say, what kind of a crazy idea is it to combine these two elements?
Yeah, I completely agree with all of that. I also feel like the being allowed to be personal is such a gift. I know for myself, like as a writer, every now and then I would sort of think to myself, well, what kind of book would I want to write? And like I said, actually, until I hit on this series, I didn't necessarily want to write a book. So, this is a question you get a lot as a writer when you're just a working writer, is your friends and family are like, when are you going to write a book? And my answer to that would be, well, never, because I just didn't think I had a book in me. And part of that is the stamina of writing something, but also part of that is the market, the book market. And I just didn't have like such an exceptional life. I mean, I'm not being humble. I'm just saying I have a very, normal, relatively happy life, and a lot of memoir. I mean, that's dead in the water. That's so boring. So that wouldn't have been my genre. And so I do think that this allows for that kind of expression and that type of writing, but always, my writing about myself in the book, and I do it all over the place. I definitely, I was very indulgent. I mean, if Amanda, if you felt like you were being indulged by memoir, I've like gone full drama queen. Like I'm like making all these grand declarations about myself and my life all throughout the book, and putting in all kinds of personal scenes. But all of that is not meant to be to spotlight myself, to be honest, even though those parts are definitely very fun to write. It's all a tool to engage the reader, because I really wanted to try in every method possible to beam the reader back to their backyard or their childhood bedroom floor, and to get them back in that mindset of, oh, here I am. Here's my little dolly. I'm world building with her. I'm making this whole persona with her. Oh, I remember this was the gift that I got at XYZ moment. This was the way that I played with Barbie. I really had that in mind. And so I use a couple different tactics to try and get the reader to engage with that, and to really try and throw themselves back there. Because I think as adults, it's very, very common for us to not engage with that part of ourselves whatsoever, to not just the memory aspect of it, but also the world building part of it. And even in our entertainment, we tend to just enter other people's worlds that they've made for us, whether we're streaming a show or whatnot. We don't remember what it was like to be a kid and to do that ourselves. And so I really did want to have that moment where I'm reminding the reader, this is how I played with my dolls. These are all the weird little games I invented with them. These are all the things that I turned into dolls that I shouldn't have played with, like all those moments. Because when I start to discuss them, the stories come out. And I've noticed that when I do readings, events, or when I just talk about my book with people, they're very quick to plug into those old stories and to remember, to go back to, oh my gosh, yes. I was just talking to someone yesterday that I had talked about a certain way that people just turn all kinds of other objects into dolls, because the impulse is so strong to have that as a toy, that we turn everything, like religious figurines, mini mannequins, all these other objects, into dolls. And this other person told me, like, yes, oh my gosh, I suddenly had this memory of, I was a little kid and my dad had these little Christmas villages that were meant to be decorative. And I constantly took the figurines and made stories out of them. And it was it was a movie set for a kid. She's sitting there, she's playing with them, she's inventing these stories. And so, but it was that moment of tripping off that memory by offering up one of my own. And that's what I'm attempting to do.
Yeah, I love that. I feel like a lot of what you're both saying also just really directs our attention to what's interesting and special about trying to think about ourselves and trying to think about culture through objects. So I feel like you've said a lot about that. I don't know if either one of you would like to add anything. What's kind of special about looking at ourselves and looking at the world in this way?
I thought of something yesterday when I was talking about the book with someone else, actually. And so, but I taught high school English for a long time before I was writing full time. And I always loved doing the sort of reading where we would talk about symbols and their archetypal significance. And I always knew some of the students were like, oh, really? Like you're going to say that this tree means life, or, whatever it was. Really, this represents the Garden of Eden? I don't think so. Like they did not. Which was always, that was part of the fun, to win over the students into like entering a world of reading objects as metaphorically significant, and sort of putting aside, did the author intend to do that? Or is everyone going to put the same figurative meaning on the literal object? No, probably, maybe not even with the author's intent, and definitely not with the reader's reading of it. But I can remember putting, let's say we were reading a text where I'd said tree before. So like where a tree was a central symbol that kept recurring, and we would just have the word tree on the board, and then almost like a free association web where students would think like life, plant, everything that came to mind. And it would just be such a rich way to start a discussion about paying attention to the objects in the text. And I loved doing it, not so much to try to win over like into the Jungian school of literary analysis, even though I truly do love that. But just as a way of thinking, like part of paying attention to what you're reading or what you're watching or the world around you is thinking about how objects convey meaning, whether we're aware of it or not, and whether it's conscious or not. And you don't even have to be into the, collective unconscious, the whole part of it, which I totally get. It's not for everybody, but, when I went to go talk to my daughter's third grade class on Wednesday, which was the cutest thing. And I asked them, what do you think of when you hear stroller? And they said almost all of the things in a third grade way that are at the heart of the book. And it was really, maybe not in the vocabulary that we would use, but they were talking about innocence and danger and ease of transport and encumbrance and keeping children safe and personal memories. And I was like, wow, that object has meaning because it's an object they're all familiar with. Even for someone who's just beginning to read, the notion of an object having a weighted meaning that we're not always consciously engaging with was already there. So I guess as maybe just to zoom back out to your question, that's what I love about the series, just even that it exists, is that it's giving validity to the idea that the objects we use every day are worthy of consideration, and that they, even if it's some of the books in the series are not objects I've spent a particular amount of time thinking about. Like I am not a particularly sporty person. So some of the ones that are more sports focused, I was thinking, I bet I would learn so much from soccer, for example, as the object lesson book, because I am unfamiliar with all of the weight that carries in our society. Anyway, so just to say that I think it's really important to have this it sort of seems like the books are part of a conversation with one another. Just to even say that it's a conversation worth having, to have these books out there.
Yeah, and I think one of the things that I think is so fascinating about our two objects in particular is that, and I've mentioned this before, like stroller is such a functional object, and doll is such a kind of a fantasy play object, and yet both of them in many instances are all about identity. And I definitely think, with the jogging stroller and the upscale stroller and all these signifiers of class and of a certain type of consumer. And definitely with dolls, the same exact thing exists, where I have an entire chapter about porcelain dolls and how much they signify a certain European white level of class and who is of importance and who gets memorialized, and what this means to grow up with this and to know, oh, this is this pristine, quote unquote, porcelain preserved version of girlhood, and this fragility and all that gets packed into that object. So I think it's really interesting that even though we have these two objects that their functions are so incredibly different, they do signify a lot of similar things there. And there is that overlap. And I explore a lot of this this longing towards European, European culture and this understanding of like, oh, this is what we should be striving for. And funnily enough, like that, there's a counterpoint to that in parenting as well. So I think that all of those things that are pushing and pulling against one another. And I think particularly for women, one of the pain points of these objects are that there isn't a lot of representation, even though you think that these objects might have some range. I mean, certainly with dolls, the hyper feminine, the hyper girly is what is celebrated and is considered to be the pinnacle of everything. I have some fun exploring celebrity dolls, and I talk about, well, which celebrities get to be memorialized this way, which ones are considered worthy candidates to put in the hands of little girls for them to emulate and for them to idolize. And, in a very early movie example, I talk about the fact that we have like kind of America's sweetheart, girl next door type of starlets they go through, but someone like Theda Barr, who always plays the vamp in silent movies, she was not considered worthy of preserving as a doll. She was not considered like toy material. So she does not go through. And so we have like a lot of this idea of who gets to be that pinnacle of success and of girlhood. Shirley Temple is another, that's kind of like the most famous example. And she came bursting into stardom in the 1930s during the Great Depression. And she was really considered the world's great soother. She was coming in to cheer everyone up, to do a little tap dance in her beautiful polka dot dress, and to get swept away by her daddy. And that was her function, and largely in her books. I mean, even before she was dollified, her movies have names that are all about her physical attributes. Curly top, dimples, all this kind of stuff is about her physicality and her adorableness. And we chose to commemorate her as a doll with all of those attributes. She's young, she's precocious, she has that cheer you up quality. And of course, as we know, that later versions of Shirley Temple weren't successful. She was only memorialized in that moment of ascension, in that moment of youth, in that moment of precociousness, and in that time when America needed her. We needed that little girl that was going to cheer us up, and then other things took its place.
Yeah, completely. I'm thinking also, you were mentioning towards the beginning of your comments about resonances between the two of your books. Mm-hmm. And that feels so interesting to me. And there seems to be some really sort of fascinating ways that your two books speak to each other, questions of creepiness or So yeah, would you both like to kind of speak a little bit about connections between the two books and between the two projects?
Well, but I think the creepiness connection, the root of that, I just have thought about this so much, is the juxtaposition of something that's meant to be totally associated with innocence and safety, with any sense of danger. That's such an uncomfortable thing to see those two sort of feelings together. I was even thinking about how when you see one of those old-fashioned prams, the lying flat you can almost imagine someone carefully nestling a baby in there. And the same way that when you see those porcelain dolls, you can imagine how gentle you have to be while holding them, even if you haven't held one in 30 years. My grandmother had some of those, and I can still remember how it felt to hold them and how I was totally aware the whole time of their delicacy. So I think there's a real sense of fragility and vulnerability in both of these objects, even if it's not so much that the stroller itself is vulnerable, but just that it's a vessel for a vulnerable infant. But and anytime there's any threat to something so vulnerable, it I think really speaks to something perhaps from our own childhoods, but thinking about just children in general, that elicits that sort of uncanny feeling. I think the definition of uncanny, or one definition, is something like the familiar with the, it's not unfamiliar, but it's the idea of what makes something uncanny is an important part of it is that it's familiar. And that's what I'm really trying to get at, that we viscerally know strollers and dolls. They're very intimate home objects. And so then when there's the threat or the maliciousness in there, it feels very, very upsetting.
Yeah, I love that. I feel like this is adding another layer because I personally have a lot of different theories. I think that the creep factor for dolls comes from a lot of different origins. And one of them, of course, is, and that's been explored to death, is the uncanny valley thing about, oh, it's something human-like. And of course, I think there's something biological even that happens with us related maybe to seeing someone who's ill or dead, where we see something that is lifelike, we go to interact with it, and it's a mannequin or something. It's not alive, and there's that repulsion, there's that kind of creepiness about it. And I totally think that that's valid, and I agree with that. But I think there are a couple other things that play with dolls too. Like I think, first of all, I think that especially for girl dolls, and this is a trope in horror movies and actually in just in science fiction movies too, that we give them this whole persona, we give them an interior life, we give them a personality, maybe we give them humanity. But then we also understand that they're passive. We can do anything we want to them, and we do mistreat them. Maybe we undress them at will. Maybe we put them in compromising situations. We leave them like, butt up in the closet for 6 days, and we don't care about them, and we let the dog chew on them. Whatever it is, damage happens to these dolls. We play with them roughly. We play with them in ways that maybe we're not supposed to. Maybe we're exploring things. Maybe we're exploring violent play. Whatever it is. And if you have that belief as a child that this doll has an identity, has an interior life, and some capacity of feeling these things, well, then you have to understand that being would be full of rage and would be angry to the point of violence. And so I think that that's a theme that gets explored quite a bit in horror movies. And there's even this sci-fi movie, Ex Machina, that plays on that theme quite a lot, where there's a lovely android, full-size doll, essentially, that's living in a glass cage by her inventor, and she plays the sweet innocent and wants to be released. And then the moment she gets released, she goes on a homicidal rampage. Spoiler alert, everyone. So this is a theme that gets explored quite a bit. And then another thing that you see come up actually in the Chucky films is that that doll is based on a real doll that was called My Buddy. And it was a simple boy doll in overalls and like a little striped shirt. There was nothing menacing about it whatsoever. But honestly, it came out in the 80s. And I think it was so threatening to men, like, oh, a boy doll, like toxic masculinity just could not handle it. And it was so vile to them that they saw it only through the lens of, well, this is something destructive. This is something that is violent, that's going to cause violence. And so I also find that very fascinating that that the idea of a boy doll is so someone's absolute horror nightmare that they decided to dream up this entire child's play movie about it, essentially. But I do like, and I do agree with the idea that there is also just that thing at heart of like, these are objects that are in our homes. They're everyday objects. You interact with them constantly. They're meant to be safe, and they're meant to keep our most cherished loved ones safe and occupied. And what if they don't? What if they're actually this destructive thing that leads to their downfall, our downfall? So
Yeah, completely. Well, it is 6:45. And so thank you both so much for all of your wonderful thoughts and reflections. At this point, I am going to ask Patricia back in, and she is going to lead us in a Q&A session. And Amanda and Maria can respond to some of all of your wonderful questions.
Well, thank you so much. It's been really thought-provoking, and object lessons is meant to make us reconsider sort of the everyday, the mundane, and you've really turned that around for us, and I love that. When we're thinking about, like, for example, with Susan, luggage or doll or a creepy baby carriage or stroller. I'm thinking Rosemary's Baby here. I just had all of these things going on. It's like dolls, scary dolls. So just thinking about when the two of you or the three of you were going to tackle this idea of object lessons, or lessons really derived from objects. How has that affected how you see things? Because I would think that you come out on the other side of this project and to have made some reconsiderations. Any surprise revelations or things you see fresh or new?
Susan, what about you? I feel like you've had the longest since your book came out to consider other objects.
Oh gosh, that's a really great question. I think I am very object obsessed in general. You all can see that my house is kind of like filled with my stuff and my collection. So I think that writing for object lessons, it also just felt like a wonderful thing to come across that series, which I think is something that both of you have said tonight, and it feels like such a wonderful community. I think it just maybe has made me sort of even more sort of honed and kind of made me pay attention more. I think that was a phrase that you used, Amanda. You said like paying attention to things. And I feel like that's a really beautiful way to think about it, that I think writing luggage certainly makes me, yes, kind of even pay attention to luggage much more today than I ever did before. I can't go anywhere or put anything in a bag without thinking about luggage. But I think it has just made me sort of pay attention even more than I did before to these kind of mundane daily objects, whether it's luggage or whether it's dishes or whether it's quilts or like other kind of everyday things that I really love. So it feels like the spirit of object lessons. I think what I'm trying to say is it sort of has like infused my life a little bit. What about the two of you? How do you feel like it's kind of, how would you both answer that?
I mean, oh no, go ahead.
Go ahead, Maria, go ahead.
I was just going to say, I mean, I've been living in that space for so long. I kind of don't even know another way of existing. Every object is fascinating to me. And I'm constantly like, oh, a stapler. Oh, the Kleenex, like whatever it is. I want to look it up and try and figure out all this hidden history and meaning behind these things. And oftentimes it's really rich and very interesting. But I mean, I did have this moment where I was contemplating what I was going to write about for quite some time. I didn't know what my book was going to be, even though it would have been obvious because, as I said, I wanted to write about something that was that feminine, that object that was formative and that had that history behind it. But I was casting around for a little while for some silly reason. I just kind of couldn't connect the dots between these things. And so I remember I was having a coffee with somebody and we were just throwing out all kinds of objects. And, at one point she was like, concrete, what if concrete is your book? And I was like, I don't think I'm the concrete girl. I mean, I hate to disappoint, but it just goes to show you, I would read a book that is concrete. And my friend started to rattle things off. She's like, you could write about all the famous streets. You could write about these buildings, like all this material and like, and just the different ways that it's perceived as both luxury and of this, this industrial material. And it just goes to show you, like, if you give any person a license to run wild with one object, they come up with everything. They start to pull it all up. It's just, it all comes up. So yeah, I absolutely think that this is something. And for myself personally, I mean, in terms of surprise, everything about this topic surprised me. Like just about, like I would just start out in one corner researching one thing, and it would just get weirder and weirder and weirder. So and that's what made it so delightful. I mean, just the chapter that I explored on Victorian dolls and the stuff that I would bump into doing that, where, I mean, I had this whole entire moment where I was researching doll coffins because that was a thing that the Victorians did. They wanted to, Queen Victoria's husband died and mourning became something that was quite fashionable. And so little girls would rehearse this and their dads would build doll coffins for them the way that a dad today might build a dollhouse. They didn't think it was morbid. They thought it was just a dress rehearsal for the reality that at some point in this little child's life, somebody they loved would die, and so they'd have to go through this process. And so this was the dress rehearsal, was put Dolly in a coffin that Daddy made. So yeah, that's just one very surprising thing that I bumped into in my research. And that's what made it so addictive. Research was far and away like my favorite thing to do for this project.
I
Amanda?
love doing research too. I also, yeah, I share Maria's sort of sentiment that being in that mentality so recently, I'm often thinking of, or even telling other friends who are writers, oh, you should pitch an object lessons book about this or about that. Because I don't think I'm the person to write some of these objects, like your concrete example, but they're, as you said, I think with the right writer and the right kind of research, almost any object could be pretty interesting. I've also started to really think about where the edge of objects is. So, you know, when I've mentioned soccer before, which is one of the other books in the series, and that's not really an object, it's an activity, or a soccer ball is an object. And I even thought about like, you know, I really like to run a lot and I do a lot of road races. And I thought, would a road race be an object? You know, if I know authors don't write more than one book in the series, but I thought if I wrote another one, would a road race be a series? And then I started to think about a lot of the other books I've read that are not part of the series that I love, that are sort of doing something similar. I was just talking about that book Wintering by Catherine May that came out
I
a
love
few years
that
ago.
book.
I loved it too. And you know, winter isn't an object, obviously, but in some ways it's a very similar spirit, I think, where she researches the history of different winter traditions and the ways that throughout history, people have dealt with these dark, cold months, and the spiritual and physical and logistical reality of these cold, dark months. And then it's, you know, woven with her experience in this one particularly hard year. But there's just a lot of books like that. Another one that came to mind right away was Catherine Schultz's Lost and Found, which maybe would be two objects lost and found. But I love that book too, the way that, you know, as she's, if anyone has read it, in the beginning, she's reflecting on the loss of her father. That's the lost chapter. But then she's also thinking much more broadly about her family's history and about the history of mourning. And then there's the found chapters about her falling in love with her wife and finding love. And that's also much more broadly about love. And she's, you know, drawing from like classical, like I think the Aeneid is part of the book, and poetry and literature. And anyway, I just have been thinking about how much I love these projects that take a fairly narrow topic, whether it's literally an object or maybe a concept or a season, but something that we're all immediately familiar with, and then comes at it from all of these different angles, including the personal. And I just want to read more and more books like that. I've realized how much I love that kind of writing.
Well, we have a question from Ariel. What is one thing you had to cut that you wish you could have included? And I'd love to hear the thing that you had to give away.
You should go first, Maria, because I didn't have to cut very much.
Yeah.
They're done. So
I do feel like I mean, I didn't actually write these portions, but there was a lot that I knew that I wouldn't be able to have the real estate to cover. And one of them that breaks my heart, I mean, I mentioned this, but I don't go into it in depth, is paper dolls. Paper dolls have this amazing history. They're so much fun. They're the most democratic toy. They were available, like a booklet of paper dolls was available at the 5 and dime. You could grab it easily, but they were also just included in movie magazines, on the sides of cereal boxes. They were in newspapers. If you were crafty, you could even just draw your own, you know, or even just cut out an advertisement and make clothes for the model just from pieces of paper and little sketches that you do. So they were really, really accessible. And for a whole generation of girls, I mean, they had their peak kind of the turn of the last century, so early 1900s. With the explosion of movies and pop culture that happened then, there were a whole bunch of paper dolls that were coming out at the time. And so we saw this culture flourish, and it was kind of pre-Barbie. That was the fashion doll of the moment. In fact, Barbie was created, Ruth Handler created her because she saw that paper dolls were so popular. And then what happened was that plastics came along, plastics were cheap as well, and they just kind of replaced paper dolls. And the tragic thing is that we've lost a lot of them. They kind of got thrown out with the old shoe boxes. So we didn't get to keep a lot of that history. And one thing that it feels very cool is that I would say that gay men are largely responsible for preserving what we do have of paper doll history. First of all, because they started to fall into obscurity, but there were some paper doll designers in the 70s and 80s when they were basically at rock bottom in terms of sales and they were falling away, that tapped into pop culture and made novelty versions of paper dolls that consisted and went on to sell. And so they really revived and thrived that market and kept it going, so that we do have a conscious history. It's not something that has completely fallen away like the egg and cup game or something. Like, it's like we still recognize it as a toy. We still see it around a little bit. And the other thing is just that gay men were so in love with old Hollywood that they were collecting the old paper dolls and they were keeping them. And so they're essentially acting as archivists. And that's part of the reason why we still have some of these older paper dolls kicking around now.
Amanda, how did you get so lucky as to not have to cut too much? What did you do? Who do you know?
Well, it's not always a good thing. In school, some students would always be like, is it okay if our paper's a little bit longer? I was never once in my life that student. To the point where certainly I could have elaborated a bit more at times. So, there were a few topics that I thought I can't even get into that, or I have to keep that very brief. There's the chapter about baby wearing and baby carriers. And I knew, I really can't open up a whole treatise on those practices and the history of those practices. So, but I don't know. I think it's the freelance essayist, is mostly the writing I've done. So that's such a much shorter form than a book that I felt like, great, I'm glad this book isn't any longer.
Well, it sounds like you were well suited to it then.
I guess so.
Good. Well, we have a question about Barbie, the enduring nature of Barbie. And of course, Ryan Gosling and Margot Robbie are wrapped filming the Barbie and Ken, and we saw little snippets of them on their little roller skates, and it's like, wow, that's very unusual. What is it about the enduring and ever-present Barbie doll?
Yeah, Barbie, I take her to task. I definitely call her out for all of her shortcomings and her crimes against humanity, in a sense, in terms of the things that you would expect a feminist to take issue which is like the beauty constraints that she puts on women and the impossible standards that she represents. And yet at the same time, she's undeniable. I do love Barbie. I still think that she's an utter joy, because she is this expression of feminine creativeness and sequins galore and this fantasy life and pink and exuberance and girly femininity. And to deny that would be, well, you'd be a killjoy. It's just, she does represent all of this fun and in this feminine universe. So I think part of the reason that she's endured so much is that she is this pinnacle of femininity. She represents the type of pinnacle feminine aspiration as like a supermodel or a Hollywood starlet. And so in that way, we can't actually see her as something that is responsible for being at the top of this hierarchy that's placed on us because of society. We have to understand that this is systemic. This is about existing in the patriarchy and being inside a society that does this to women, right? But yeah, I think that Barbie, because she has all of this joyfulness attached to her, all this sexiness attached to her. I like to joke that she's like all femme and no fatale. She's just fun. She's just playful and sexy. And kids, by the way, they do pick up on the sexy element of her. There is a lot of doll play around Barbie that is around that. And there's an entire hidden history about Barbie where she was originally, she's a doll that was based on a German cartoon. And the German cartoon was about this depending on your interpretation, a sex worker that was trying to get by in Germany's post-war years and was getting by on her looks and was sort of trading favors with men in order to make rent and to have clothes and to have a nice life. And so I think that all of those things are actually still entirely baked into Barbie and present in Barbie, and kids recognize that, and they actually, they're playing with it. They're having fun with, a very beautiful, sexy, hyper feminine woman, and trying on that identity. And I personally find it very fun to see Barbie and Barbie core, which is the trend, the fashion trend that has gone along with the movie of head to toe pink, and lots of just those expressions of like even just pink wigs, pink nails. You're expressing this doll culture.
I totally thought you were going to say something about how Skipper has been slighted all of these many decades, and just the injustices
right.
her being just
Skipper step aside. No, no way. Leave Skipper out of it. But I will say, my hot take on the Barbie movie is that Ken should not be the co-star. He should just appear like 5 times in the movie, because all the girls that I know that played with Barbie, we had like, maybe like 10 Barbies and 1 Ken. Like, he was an afterthought. He was the thing that you would just get at a birthday party or something. He was never meant to be the star of the show. He's just a hanger on. So that's my hot take there. But yes, so I would say, Barbie, all of her exuberance, when women put on the Barbie clothes, full-grown women, they're dressing up as Barbie now. They're kind of saying, hey, here I am. I'm your dream girl. I've arrived. I am the pinnacle of this, hyper feminine, successful, beautiful Barbie doll. And they're saying it with a wink, but they're still saying it.
Well, we're at the top of the hour, but do you feel like you can take one more question? We have one, but I don't know, I want to respect your time. And Susan, are you okay with that?
Of course, I would love it if you wanted to take one more question. That would be great. I'm having such a good time.
Good. Okay. So this is from Clay. What is something that you found in the process of writing, and I don't think researching, where your evidence disagreed with your priors? What you thought the evidence would say and it didn't. And Amanda, do you want to jump in there first?
Sure. I feel like Maria and I have talked about this a bit. Our books came out so close to one another that we've talked a few times, just about the whole launch process. And one of the things that came up for both of us, I think, I don't want to speak for you, but is that a lot of times I would set out to write a chapter and then the answer would be sort of like, and it's both. I was reading something that another writer wrote about Stroller, and he had said that even though the book is in some ways like a capitalist critique of this consumer culture, buy the best stroller, the most expensive one means you're a better parent. 100% the book is doing that. But then this other writer was sort of saying like, but actually Amanda likes her stroller. And that I didn't necessarily go in with a prior attempt to sort of say strollers are horrible or I feel imprisoned by my stroller. But each chapter that I wrote, I kept seeing a new way that if strollers are a metaphor, it was a contradictory metaphor. So the one I started out with was the idea of a running stroller, which was actually the initial idea that I pitched. I remembered just recently that it literally, makes you run slower if you're pushing this heavy thing. So it slows you down, but it also, when I was running a lot with a running stroller, when I would do a race or something, I would be so much faster than I used to be because suddenly I had, it was like taking off a weighted vest. So it slowed you down, but made you stronger. And I thought, well, that's such a great metaphor for parenthood. And then I started to think about other ways, like the primary one in the end was sort of the idea that strollers are meant to keep children safe, but they're also literally pushing them out into the world so they have a view of what's around them. You're literally pushing them away from you, which kind of becomes like a punchline in some satire about anti-stroller culture. But so I think for me, it was more that within each lens, so like the way my book is structured, each chapter kind of looks at strollers through a different type of cultural criticism. I saw a new way that the metaphor of that chapter was contradictory. Like, I guess maybe to answer Clay's question, the most obvious one that comes to mind right now is that when I started writing the chapter about stroller culture abroad, I was coming in a very grouchy mood, and I was like, it's going to be like, isn't it the worst here? It's so much better. Like I was thinking about these countries that have more generous family leave policies and, places where pedestrian access in cities is better, all of these reasons that we know about in certain European cities, for example, that would certainly make life easier with a stroller. And those things themselves were true. But then, I talked to a friend of mine who had spent a lot of time living in Germany, and I was waiting for her to say all these things. And she did say that those things were true. But she also talked about how there's a culture of, like if you break any rules in, like, let's say you're on the wrong side of the staircase that goes up to the accessible part of the subway that you have the stroller, you'll get scolded publicly and shamed for being on the wrong part of the, so she was, having actually lived in another culture, was like, yes, there are some wonderful things about having a small child in Germany, and that, she listed a bunch of great things that I wish we had here. But then, just like any culture, there were things that were frustrating. And even she talked a lot about this term Rabenmutter, which is like a derogatory term for women who let someone else watch their children. And it's meant to call them a raven, who abandons the babies. And so she said that's still a very common notion, that if a woman works or lets someone else take care of her children, that's in some way a failure or bad. So I guess just that I was sort of in that particular chapter, I came in a mood and really having a bit of an agenda about some of the logistical difficulties of having young kids in the US. And even as much as those were true, I saw lots of ways that it's not necessarily as a whole superior somewhere else,
Yeah, Amanda, I just want to add that I loved the way that you described the child-friendly versus what was the other phrase? Child-centric. And you were comparing Germany. Was it Germany and the US?
Yep.
And you were saying that Germany was child-friendly but not child-centric, and the US was child-centric but not child-friendly. And I thought that distinction was perfect.
It was my friend who came up with that distinction, and I thought about it all the time. And it's, I've, throughout that whole chapter, I kept coming back to that.
Yeah. For myself, I had the same exact experience, in the sense that, like, I don't think I ever started out with the premise that I was like, oops, I'm wrong. And maybe part of that was that I was already quite familiar with doll history, just being my little junior researcher that I was back when I was a kid. So I did know something about the history of toys, and something about, I think, and I document this in the book, what I did do is that I went through my own development, my own thoughts about this. So the Barbie chapter is actually this perfect example of it, where I talk about being a very angry punk rock riot girl feminist in the 90s, and having super angry feelings about Barbie, and writing some really terrible poetry about how she was damaging, and how stupid I thought she was, and I was dismissing her and attributing all this harm to her. And so I go through all of that. And of course, at the same time, I'm bringing up other examples of other, feminist movements that had villainized Barbie. And then I get to the point where I say, hey, I actually, quote unquote, met Barbie many, many years ago when I was watching Saturday morning cartoons. This is how she made me feel. This is what she offered to me. And this is her secret history. This is what she comes loaded with, all of this sexuality. And this is how I, as a little girl that was very conditioned to be, quote unquote, a good girl, and grew up in a Catholic society, how I got to play the vamp and play out a lot of this sexuality in a very safe space, thanks to Barbie. And so I go through all these other different ways that she can be seen as even progressive, or something that that offered an outlet in an otherwise more conservative space, particularly for women. And I do that repeatedly throughout the books. I also set up something similar with porcelain dolls, where I talk about how they were this object of complete desire, and they were there's something that is an object of fantasy for me. And then I talk about, here's all the damaging things that they contributed to the world and to my life. And then another one that I think has a topsy-turvy kind of moment, where we go through all the valleys, the hills and valleys of it, is American Girl Doll, because I readily admit that, well, first of all, I'm a Samantha. That's my that's my American Girl Doll affiliation. I identified and grew up with her. No surprise, I'm sure, to those of you familiar with the American Girl Doll universe. And so I talk about how, American Girl Doll, they are very responsible for introducing a whole wave, a sea change in the world of historians. People grew up with those dolls, and so they've realized, this is a field I can go into. This is something that I can study, that I can be interested in. They've sparked all of these women to go into that field. And yet at the same time, there's so many things about the narrative that, looking back, are really lacking, starting with the very simple premise that the first 3 dolls were all white and all their stories are centered on that white narrative. So there's a lot of good and bad mixed into all of this. And I think the best thing that we can do as writers when we're exploring this is to just go through all of it and just say, when sometimes parents will ask me, is Barbie good or bad? They're just kind of trying to decide, like, do I let my little girl play with it? But I'll just say, yes. Yes, both. She's both.
Well, I think that seems to encapsulate some things that you've all said tonight about this strange, contradictory, double-sided nature of looking at objects and what they mean to people. And of course, I'm reminded of that book by historian Jill Lepore, The Secret History of Wonder Woman, and that way of looking at the female figure. But also I think about Stroller that way. When I think of it, sort of like, it could be the Mercedes, it could be the BMW, it could be, my, Honda Fit, maybe. There's just different ways of looking at objects and kind of thinking what they say about gender and hierarchies. And I love that. And of course, luggage. Could we just talk about luggage and go on for days? I mean, really, about what luggage tells us, especially with all those stickers on them. But I appreciate object lessons, and I feel like the 3 of you, and Susan being the moderator tonight, have really drawn out these amazing ideas and given us a lot of nuance. And rather than being pinned down, Amanda Parrish Morgan and Maria Teresa Hart, you said, look carefully, look closely, contextualize, reconsider. No easy answers here. And I want to thank you all so much for being here and for participating in the Object Lesson series, because it's really an eye-opener.
Thank you so much for having us.
Yes, thank you all.
And thank you, Susan, for moderating.
Of course, it's been such a pleasure. Thank you both. And it's just so nice to be in the same series with you. It feels like such a wonderful community. And my dog Millie agrees, as you can see. She's a big fan of object lessons as well.
Thank you, audience. Good night. We
Thank you
appreciate
all.
you being here.
Thank you, everyone.